What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and over the last couple days, we have gotten a lot of previews from Warhammer Community talking about the new releases for the upcoming Black Templars supplement, and I wanted to talk about these previews and maybe extrapolate a little bit based on previous versions of the Black Templars rules of some of the final rules that we could see for this Space Marine chapter once its supplement is fully released. Over the course of the last week, we've seen a lot of previews of the very cool models that are coming out for this chapter. One of the biggest model-wise releases that we've seen for a Space Marine chapter from 9th edition so far. I don't think any of the other Space Marine supplements have really gotten the same level of releases that we've gotten for Black Templars. In fairness, a lot of that is because Black Templars have been kind of maligned, I think, by at least the Games Workshop design team since 8th edition. They got like a White Dwarf supplement, which is where we've gotten a lot of their current rules. In fairness, those rules are pretty good and have seen some success, especially with, weird wombo combos like Devout Push, but it's not a full supplement, really. Like, we don't have a lot of the rules that other Space Marine chapters get access to. But now we're getting not only a bunch of rules, and it looks like what's over and above what other Space Marine chapters have, but also a bunch of new models as well. Talking about this guy, a little homage to some classic Games Workshop art. He looks pretty good. A lot of people have complained that he's very chunky. I mean, part of it is because, like, look at these shoulder pads. They're so big. They got these big skulls on them, and I think the skulls definitely increase the thickness of the shoulder pads, which definitely makes the model larger. But also, if you notice, his habit is actually over top of his power armor chestplate here. So I think that actually is increasing the volume of the armored body in such a way that a normal Space Marine, like armored Space Marine, wouldn't look like, which is why he looks a little bit thicker with multiple C's than he does normally. That said, in comparison images to Primaris Space Marines, he actually looks around the same size as a Primaris Space Marine, and I think this is indicative of the upscaling we're seeing of the Space Marine line. We've already seen it with some of the Chaos Space Marine releases, where the more recent Chaos Space Marine kits have been around the same size as Primaris kits, and now we're seeing it with the Loyalist Marines as well. Games Workshop has also come out and said that you can use this guy as either a Primaris Castellan or a Firstborn Castellan. I don't know if those will be two separate datasheets. That's certainly what it sounds like, but I mean, that's kind of cool, actually, this guy just being a generic Space Marine man, and you can use him as either generation. A lot of people have been asking this to happen for the entire line and just say a Space Marine is a Space Marine is a Space Marine, which, I mean, I'd be fine with. I think the distinction is a little bit silly at this point. It is kind of fun that they do have their own rule sets, and there is, strengths and weaknesses to having a Primaris versus a non-Primaris body, but mostly it depends on who can take jump packs and who can fit into certain transports, which has always felt a little bit arbitrary to me. We also saw an updated model for the hero of Hell's Reach himself, Grimaldus, who looks great. The old model is a little bit wiggy. We also saw new Helbrecht, new Sword Brethren, new Cenobite Servitors. Basically, a full-line re-release for these Black Templars in this new supplement, which is pretty exciting, to say the least. But what we really want to talk about today are the rules of this updated chapter, and we've gotten some very exciting previews so far from these Warhammer Community articles. The first one, and potentially most impactful, being Templar Vows, which is a new, unique Black Templar mechanic. Now, it's important to note is that Templar Vows they're basically a pre-game selection, so they aren't something that you are required to put onto your army list, and they happen in a bit of an awkward phase. A lot of these, if you consider something like Sororitas Sacred Rites, those happen at the start of the first battle round, and a lot of these pregame selections happen then. The Templar Vows, in fact, actually start at the end of the Read Mission Briefing step, which I don't know is a step that has had any relevance previously in the 40k rules. This step basically occurs before you set up the table, so it happens theoretically before you look at terrain. Basically, as soon as you look at the mission in your opponent's army list, you'll pick your vows right then and before you do anything else. It's probably going to be a little bit tough in sort of a competitive environment where the maps and layouts are predetermined, but it is important to note that you also do it before you select secondary objectives, which is pretty important, because that happens 3 steps later in the sequence. Now, there's 4 vows you can pick, and a couple of them have been spoiled already. Suffer not the unclean to live, uphold the honor of the emperor, abhor the witch, destroy the witch, and accept any challenge no matter the odds. Interestingly, only units with the Templar Vows ability gain the effects of the vow, and we don't yet know which units are going to have this ability. While it may very well be that it's sort of a chapter tactic that the entire army is going to get if you're in a Black Templars detachment, or maybe if you have a pure Black Templars army. But I think there is the possibility that it ends up being something that only certain units get access to, so something that only like Sword Brethren or particular characters get access to. Maybe it's an upgrade, sort of like inducting something into the Deathwing that you can add to existing units so they get the effects of this vow. That's going to be interesting to see, but the effects of the vows that have been spoiled so far are pretty impactful. Except at any challenge no matter the odds, for example, basically always counts you as charging for the purposes of shock assault, and it always counts you as gaining the bonus of assault doctrine. And based on the recent FAQ that extrapolates any super doctrines from a doctrine that you're considered to have active, then they will always get the effect of their super doctrine. Now, there's no telling whether or not that remains the same, where they get the gene rot might affect in the assault doctrine in the future. It might be something different, who knows, but I think that is still a very powerful ability. Downside is you can't fall back, which most of the time you're taking Oaths of Moment for a Space Marine army, so it's probably fine. I do like that these effects have both benefits and drawbacks. It's very thematic for Black Templars, given that the theme is supposed to be sort of unrestrained zeal. We also see Abhor the Witch, Destroy the Witch, do a once per game activation of +3 to your movement characteristic. It also gives you reroll 1s to wound in melee against Psychers, which is fine, but not that exciting. The downside being that if you have a Psyker unit within 18, you can't perform actions. So I really like the design of this vow, because while it is very powerful against armies with lots of Psychers, giving you that sort of army-wide rerolls in melee, or depending on how many units actually ends up getting those vows. The downside of, going up against Grey Knights or Thousand Sons or something like that, almost your entire army not being able to perform actions, they're just too distracted by the Psychers that are standing nearby them, is a pretty big downside. It sort of cuts off secondary objectives like raise the banners high, because a large part of your army may not be able to complete those objectives. It basically means that there's a trade-off where you could get those reroll 1s to wound, but you knock yourself out of being able to perform or complete a lot of those action-specific secondaries, versus using it on an army where there are comparatively less Psychers. You can consider something like, I don't know, Tyranids or Eldari, where they're almost guaranteed to have Psychers, I guess like sort of Craft World specifically. But on the flip side, those Psychers tend to play very conservatively and kind of hide in the back. So you're not as worried about not being able to perform your actions, but you don't really get the benefit of those reroll 1s to wound. Still, getting that +3 inches of movement is a huge deal. That's a super powerful ability. As any player will tell you, getting additional movement in 40k is, one of the most powerful things you can do. Now, they do interestingly mention that Outriders could get up to movement 17, so that implies that Outriders will get access to this ability. So to me, that kind of says that it's probably an army-wide ability. Now, before we move on, the article did actually mention that the Templar Vows, the last time they were seen was in the 3rd edition release of the Black Templars Codex. And so I actually went through and I dug up a copy of that codex to talk about the original vows and how they worked originally, and maybe if we could extrapolate any potential mechanics for the 2 remaining vows from what we have in this original codex. I'm just noticing right here, there's a typo under this kill them all ability. We're playing Warhammer 4000 now, everybody. These books were just getting phased out when I first started playing 40k as a little baby, so this is definitely a walk down memory lane for me. This original format for the 40k codex is basically unreadable. These were very dense books. There's a lot of just text on a page. But basically, in the original version of this vow mechanic, only Emperor's champions could recite them, essentially, and they would be an upgrade for your Emperor's champion specifically, who was, in their own right, a powerful character that you would basically build any Black Templars army you were playing around. These actually increase the points cost of the Emperor's Champion, and then would affect your whole army basically as soon as the Emperor's Champion hit the table. Now, the names of the vows are actually the exact same, and to start off with, we saw these 2 previewed in the Warhammer Community article. Now, interestingly, the effect is kind of the same, the difference being that the original version of this vow gave you a d6 consolidation move at the start of the games and had to be towards the nearest enemy unit, but it also gave you a 5+ deny against psychic powers. Now, This has sort of been rolled into the Black Templars chapter tactic with that 5+ warded damage ignore roll against mortal wounds. But the movement portion of the vow has definitely remained mostly the same. Accept any challenge, no matter the odds, forced you to charge. So this one actually changed quite a bit. Instead of being unable to fall back, you had to charge. So there's a little bit of a consistency there in that it restricts what you can do on the tabletop. Doctrines and super doctrines weren't a thing back in the day. So instead, what this ability did was give you preferred enemy against the enemy army, which was rerolls to hit, which, I mean, in fairness, is like way more powerful. Preferred enemy used to specify a particular unit type, though. So a lot of things like, I think Crimson Fist had like preferred enemy orcs. So they would reroll hits in close combat against orcs. And in this case, it would just bracket like whatever your opponent's army was, so you would always get rerolls to hits against them. That is super powerful, but I think it generally paled in comparison to some of the other options that we're going to talk about momentarily for these two sort of unreleased vows: suffer not the unclean to live and uphold the honor of the emperor. Then obviously is super duper powerful. I think way more powerful than giving yourself +1 AP in close combat. So I'm not surprised that didn't really make the transition over in quite the same way. Just give yourself like a melee chapter master on your whole army. That's fine. The other two that we haven't seen from the 9th edition Codex are suffer not the unclean to live and uphold the honor of the emperor. Uphold the honor of the emperor is an interesting effect. It essentially removes all your cover saves, but gives you a 6+ invulnerable save. I could potentially see this making its way over, maybe in a slightly different form. Given that Games Workshop has liked to use the like X strength suffers -1 damage in recent codexes, I almost wonder if we see something like that, where maybe it's a damage reduction or a damage ignore effect. I don't think we would see a damage ignore roll because they've been shifting away from that, except in very specific circumstances, because it tends to kind of exponentially increase the amount of time that a game takes to resolve. But we could also see that 6+ invulnerable save be retained. The effect would be pretty limited, and it wouldn't really make the army that much more complex. And against armies like Sisters of Battle that have a lot of AP4, it can actually be pretty powerful. It also made you immune to the effects of pinning. I would be surprised if there wasn't a morale component to this, where maybe we just saw you immune to combat attrition or something like that. Suffer not the unclean to live is the last one, and it is definitely a weird one. It gives you +1 strength in close combat, but you reduce your initiative by 1, so you fought at initiative 3, I think they would make them, which meant that other Space Marines would hit before them, but they would hit back harder. Sort of an interesting trade, I guess. Generally, initiative modifiers just turned into fight last in 9th edition, and I don't think that is how it's going to work in 9th edition. If it gives your entire army fight last, that would be not very good. I almost wonder if this becomes another activated ability, kind of like the Abhor the Witch ability. Like maybe you can give yourself fight last in order to get +1 to wound, +1 strength maybe. I don't know. Like something, an effect like that could be very interesting, and actually when used a little bit more judiciously, I think that could be powerful. Like once you're going into a tar pit style unit that doesn't really punch your power armor very well, then you could make yourself fight last, take the hit, maybe you lose a guy, but your whole unit's +1 to wound, and then you do a lot more damage. I think that would be cool. This effect is definitely the most foreign to 9th edition 40k, given that initiative hasn't been in the game for a long time. So with that, kind of an interesting look at the OG versions of those Templar Vows, let's talk about some of the Black Templar relics that have been spoiled. And this is really interesting because Black Templars, it looks like, are going to have a different relationship with relics than any other Space Marine chapter. This is because of this new Relic Bearer's ability, which unlocks some upgrades to your infantry or biker units if you've taken a chaplain already. So this is kind of a special issue war gear style upgrade. Special issue war gear essentially lets you pick a veteran sergeant to receive one of a smaller selection of relics. Normal Space Marine chapters have access to that, but it sounds like this is going to be a little bit more fine-tuned version. I guess maybe a little bit more like the deadly pathogens from Death Guard, which gives you access to some specific upgrades that you can give to your characters or your unit leaders, specifically your unit champions in Death Guard Marine units. This one specifically excludes characters, but like that deadly pathogens, it sounds to me like it's going to be a points upgrade. It also specifies that you should make the model carrying the relic unique, which is going to be a bit of an interesting dynamic because I think in the past, sort of relic upgrades have not really been required to be WYSIWYG. Basically, as long as you have the base weapon or whatever you're upgrading with them, that's been good enough. With this Black Templars upgrade sprue, Games Workshop obviously wants you to buy that upgrade kit in addition, and they already previewed some of what seems to be these relic upgrades that are in that kit. And I wouldn't be surprised if, in the not-too-distant future, they require you to use those pieces if you've decided to use these upgrades. I hope that's not the case, because it sounds like a nightmare, but it could very well be what happens. Now, off the top of my head, the other relics that are on that upgrade SKU are the Aurelian Shroud, which currently is a once-per-game use of a 4+ invulnerable save to core within 3 inches, if I remember correctly, which is like a wildly powerful ability, and it gives Black Templars a limited use of some of the most resilient, especially dreadnoughts in the game, which is really exciting. It lets you take a brick of Redemptor dreadnoughts and make them ridiculously difficult to kill for the first exchange of firepower, which in some matchups can give them a leg up over a little bit more of a sustained damage like Deathwatch. The Demon Skull of Cacodamus, I think is the name of the relic, is also there, as well as the Holy Orb that we're going to talk about in this video. The Aurelian Shroud is this one. Got a real Shroud of Turin kind of vibe to it. As a side note, I am a little bit worried about this upgrade sprue in particular, just because it has the shotgun upgrades for the new, quote unquote new scout models, the neophyte models that are going to be in the Crusader kit, which implies that those shotguns are not included in that Crusader kit as standard, even though they're evidently going to be an upgrade for those neophytes, which is a little bit disconcerting, because basically the kit is not including all of the options that the unit could normally have, and you're then required to purchase a second kit in order to assemble those models how you want, which is kind of a big ol' feel bads. That's definitely not the first time that that's happened, and especially for some weirder upgrades, that's definitely the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if these shotguns are really pushed in these neophyte units, and you're sort of required to either make your own or get scout squads or get your own Black Templars upgrade kits in order to upgrade those guys, which would be really unfortunate. The Crusader helm is also supposedly this helmet, and I guess the idea here being that you're kind of required to get this kit in order to not only upgrade the scouts, but also get these relics unlocked, which isn't the greatest thing ever. But what do these relics do is the question, and we do have a couple of them that have been previewed. First off, the Holy Orb, which is awesome. We've already seen an effect like this with the Plague Skull of Glothila from, again, Death Guard, which is, just essentially a grenade weapon that just does a thing automatically, and the Holy Orb is very similar to that. The Holy Hand Grenade over here, on a 2+, smites something within 6 inches, invisible. This is also in your shooting phase, but it's not a shooting activation, which means that A, you don't have to select the unit to shoot in order to use the orb, which means that you could potentially use the orb, deal D3 to something, see how much you do, shoot with a different unit, and then go back and shoot with the original unit, or vice versa, which is pretty good. Anytime you get manipulation of the phase like that, it's very solid. In addition, it also applies a Fight Last ability to the unit that you hit. This is really good. Fight Last abilities on a stick are always awesome, and within 6 inches of you is pretty solid. Big downside is that you can't use it defensively. It's only offense, since it happens in your own shooting phase, and it only affects you for that round. But what it does do is mean that the unit with the Holy Orb can basically choose something to be uninterruptible for that subsequent fight phase. Now, the other interesting thing is that because the Holy Orb is not a ranged attack at all, it doesn't have any restrictions on what you did that turn regarding whether or not you can use it. So the unit could fall back and Holy Orb something, you could advance and Holy Orb something. You can also hit characters with it regardless of whether or not they're lookout surd. So if you need to put D3 mortal wounds through a shadow field or something, you just toss this grenade at them and they die. That seems pretty solid. This upgrade seems great. We also see the Icon of Heinemann, which gives you ignore AP 1 and 2 on the model that is carrying the relic. Interestingly, it's also important to note that the Holy Orb only affects the model carrying it, so the model who's holding the grenade has to be the one within 6 inches of the target unit. It does mean that, if your unit can string out, which some of these big Crusader squads can absolutely, get very large, you do have to be very careful with the positioning of your sergeants or whoever's holding that orb. so that they're in range to use it at the time that you need it to. Now, the icon here, ignore AP 1 and 2, is a pretty good effect, especially on a more heavily armored model. So something like a Terminator ignoring AP 1 and AP 2 is a pretty big deal, especially if you're in a unit that already has an invulnerable save. For example, in a Blade Guard veteran unit that has a 2+ armor save thanks to those storm shields, AP 2 is the AP value that you really want in order to punch through that 2+ armor save and not hit the invulnerable save. I talked about efficient attack application in a recent video, and that's a good example of it. You really want AP2 against that 2+, 4+ invulnerable save profile, but the icon totally messes that up, because AP3 you'll just allocate to the units with the storm shields, and they'll just take it on the 4+ invulnerable save. But AP2 you can allocate to the Heinemann model, and he's going to take a 2+ armor save instead. Now, the big downside there is that it also gives your opponent some sort of control over how wounds get allocated, because as soon as you allocate a hit to that dude who's carrying the icon, you are required to continue allocating all hits that the unit receives to him for the rest of that phase. So they could, for example, shoot you with an AP2 weapon, you take it on the icon guy to pass it on a 2+, then they shoot you with the last cannon that's AP3, and you have to take it on your icon guy, which ignores the effect of the icon. So it kind of introduces its little mini game, which is super cool. I love this relic. This is actually really cool. And that's all because it only affects the model carrying the relic. Putting it on a unit who's not the unit champion, so not the sergeant of the unit, is actually a pretty good idea, because then you don't have to allocate any attacks to him. And if you lose a guy, you just lose a normal dude. And it's makes it sort of interesting. You get like these one-off, basically squad upgrades. He's kind of a special weapon guy, but he's like holding a shield generator basically instead of a bigger gun or whatever. Now, obviously, both of these relics are very powerful, and I think a lot of these Black Templar armies are going to be spending points to upgrade themselves with these relics, and they're definitely going to make a Black Templars army really interesting to play against, where you can have a lot of unique units, each of them with their own abilities that are granted by these relics. I am a little bit worried that the bookkeeping is going to get pretty intense, and we've kind of seen that a lot as 9th edition has gone through. Armies like especially Thousand Suns, with the amount of tracking they have to do throughout the phase, especially their psychic phase, it gets a little crazy. And with a lot of these individual unit upgrades as well as once per game abilities, otherwise these abilities seem super thematic, they seem super cool, and I am psyched to see Black Templars on the table, and potentially with a very powerful supplement. Space Marines in general have been a little bit down in the dumps lately. They're certainly being buoyed up by some subfactions, especially Death Watch right now, which has some pretty good combos and effects that they can use. But it's certainly not perfect, and Space Marines have been kind of crying out for, I guess, an Emperor's Champion to lead them forward into the 9th edition metagame. And if this is the style of book that we can expect from future Space Marine supplement releases, I'm going to be super excited. Interesting Space Marine abilities, but not necessarily kind of dramatically overpowered, which is what a lot of the 9th edition codexes have been so far. Anyway, that's all I have to say about the Black Templars spoilers. Hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to drop a like, drop a subscribe if you have. Big thanks to everyone who watched all the way to the end here, as well as everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people are phenomenal. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.